We are Wayne Church, a United Methodist Community. But what does that name mean exactly? Well, we're located in Wayne. We are a church. United and community are great descriptors for a church, but Methodist, what exactly does it mean to be a Methodist? My understanding is that about 8 years ago, this church ceased to call itself Wayne United Methodist Church, even though we still are on foundational documents, but instead leaned into being Wayne Church, a United Methodist Community. This acknowledges that we're kind of past the fierce denominationalism of decades ago. A lot of people today don't care quite as much about particular denominations, not to mention that sometimes people associate denominations with harm. They've heard of that one priest or that errant youth pastor, and they don't remember the exact church, but they do remember the denomination that they were a part of. And so we try to eschew these kinds of labels. Never mind, in the case of us here, that we can see another church that also refers to itself in the community as Wayne Church. Never mind the fact that last year we took in 8 new adult members, 7 of which were already connected to another United Methodist Church before being here. Nevertheless, we have leaned into this label of being Wayne Church, a United Methodist Community. Still, as we seek to live into this identity, it's important for you to know at least a little bit about what it means to be United Methodist. Because I must admit that there was a time whenever I fully understood wanting to set those labels aside, even though I had always been part of a United Methodist church. There was a time whenever I was done. And it wasn't because of any of the harm that the denomination was doing. It wasn't because I had any disagreements with the denomination. I couldn't have had any disagreements with the denomination because I didn't really know anything about the denomination. I didn't know any historical figures. I didn't know any distinctive hymns. I didn't know any unique beliefs or practices. So I chose to set the whole thing aside. And yet, here I am. I'm not going to tell you the whole story, and I am a United Methodist pastor, and I want you to know just a little bit more about what exactly that means. You see, almost 300 years ago, a group of young people in Oxford, England, got together, and they devised a method to following Jesus. To them, there was actually a method to the madness. As they sought to devise their method, people demeaned them for doing so. They were characterized as being too enthusiastic about their particular way of doing things and how set that they were, that there was a certain way that we could follow Jesus, certain things that we should do, certain things that we shouldn't do. And yet, what others meant as an insult, they took on with pride. They said, yes, we are Methodists. We do have a certain way of following Jesus, and we're darn proud of it. So, last week we began this series of talks by noting the most distinctive element of Wesleyan theology, Wesley being the co-founders of Methodism, John and Charles, and that's grace. Grace, which is unmerited kindness. You see, God's grace goes before us and takes all of our past experiences and prepares us to meet God. And then God meets us right where we are and saves us and gives us assurance that we are right with Him. And then God's grace continues to work on us all the days of our lives until we are conformed into the image of Christ. Grace, the most important part of United Methodism. Now, 56 years ago, on this upcoming Tuesday, a few denominations came together to form what we now know as the United Methodist Church. It began with the Methodist Church, and they merged with a denomination known as the Evangelical United Brethren Church, and they formed the United Methodist Church. 56 years ago this Tuesday. This church was part of the Methodist denomination. Other churches were part of the Evangelical United Brethren denomination. And did you know how we got united in our name? It's not so much a note of unity, but rather a descriptor from this particular predecessor denomination in terms of the Evangelical United Brethren Church. See, the Methodist Church got to keep Methodist from the name, and Evangelical United Brethren got to keep United from the name. So we became the United Methodist Church, and we adopted this symbol of a cross with two flames, the two flames noting the two traditions of the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren, or EUB tradition. Two streams coming together as one, the cross of Christ and the flames of the Holy Spirit. Now, I must say that for April 1968 America, a cross with flames is an interesting choice of symbol, especially given that that was the exact same month that Dr. King was assassinated. But nevertheless, there is positive Christian imagery to the cross of Christ and the flames of the Holy Spirit. So whenever these two denominations came together, they brought their founding documents with them. And did you know that we're actually not able to edit or alter these founding documents of these two predecessor denominations? The Methodists had their Articles of Religion. The EUB Church, I'm just going to start calling them EUB because Evangelical United Brethren is a long name. I'm glad we just went with United from that group. So anyways, they came with their confession of faith. And so the Articles of Religion and the Confession of Faith are a set of paragraphs that detail our beliefs on God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, the Bible, the church, humanity, and God's reign, among many other things. And so, while these statements could be read in only a matter of moments, they are still several paragraphs. And what you'll find is that if you read them, you'll see why these two traditions came together to form a new denomination. They held a lot of things in common. That's at least in part because the EUB Church copied their Confession of Faith from the Methodist Articles of Religion, but it's okay because the Methodist Church copied their Articles of Religion from the Articles of Religion of the Anglican Church. It's great to share. You can read these statements, and it might only take you like 15 minutes or so to read these statements of several paragraphs of belief of the two predecessor denominations. Again, documents that are protected from alteration. So anytime you hear somebody saying, I heard that those Methodists aren't going to believe that Jesus is God or that he rose from the dead or they aren't going to believe in the Bible anymore, tell them, no, we're not allowed to stop those beliefs. Who would want to stop those beliefs anyway? All right, so that's one way to understand a United Methodist framework of belief. But there's another way, too. Dare I say, there's a simpler way to understand a United Methodist framework in terms of belief. And that would be to turn to another protected document that we aren't able to edit, and those are the general rules of the Methodist Church. These were written nearly 300 years ago by John Wesley. There's only 3 general rules. Some people even call them the 3 simple rules. They're simple in terms of their brevity, but maybe more complex in terms of what they require us in living a Christian life. And they seek to answer that question. What does it take in order to live a Christian life? They're intensely practical. After all, co-founders of Methodism, John and Charles Wesley, they were brothers. John wrote sermons. Charles, his brother, wrote hymns. They weren't interested in theological textbooks, but they were interested in doing what they needed to do so that their churches could have a framework for living and then get out there and practice it. Not to spend too much time up here in their heads, but to really put their faith into their hands and their feet and their hearts. So, these general rules of the Methodist Church formed a basis for what they called societies. Before there was a Methodist Church, there were Methodist societies, and these societies subdivided into classes or small groups to hold each other accountable. Now, if you wanted to get into a Methodist society, the admission requirement was quite simple. All that John Wesley required for admission was a desire to flee from the wrath to come and to be saved from their sins. Boy, that's fun to talk about, right? The wrath to come and the need for our salvation from our sins. Well, as long as you can acknowledge that, As long as you desired to get away from that kind of stuff, then you were in to the Methodist societies. But they didn't want you to only give your admission to the society in terms of what you said, but they were much more interested in how you lived out your life. In fact, the General Rules wrote, it is therefore expected of all who continue therein that they should continue to evidence their desire of salvation first by doing no harm, by avoiding every kind of evil, especially that which is most generally practiced. And then John, in his 18th century English, goes on to list out a long list of things that he thinks that you should avoid, evil practices that he believes should be avoided, so that we might first do no harm. Now, we could look at that list. It would be worth your time to Google the general rules of the Methodist Church and to read all of John's words in their 18th century glory about the specific practices to avoid in order to avoid doing harm. But some of them do take a little bit of translation in terms of getting us to where we are today and what's evil today versus what was going on in the early part of the 1700s whenever John was writing. So for our purposes, let's focus on the general rule itself, which is to first do no harm. Spoiler alert, next week we're going to move on to the second general rule, which is to do good. But before we can move on to doing good, we need to first do no harm. Because we can think that we're doing all of the good in the world, but if we're harming people, they're not going to receive the good that we're doing. Sometimes we need to avoid doing certain things before we can move into the things that God actually wants us to do. The idea that we would first do no harm is something that probably everyone can agree upon. Whether you follow Jesus, whether you follow a United Methodist tradition of following Jesus, no matter what, we can probably all agree on that first general rule of doing no harm. But whenever you think about this rule, what comes to your mind? Is it the words of John Wesley, or is it a different context that you might think of whenever you hear the words first do no harm? Because living a long time before John Wesley was Hippocrates, who also said first do no harm. Yes, it's in the context of medicine that maybe a lot of us think about first doing no harm. Many people think that this is in the Hippocratic Oath. It's not. It's in another one of his writings. But nonetheless, coming 1700 plus 500 is 2,200 years before John Wesley is Hippocrates. He did come first in saying this. And I think it's fascinating what Harvard medical faculty member has to say in his commentary on this rule of Hippocrates. He writes, doctors should neither overestimate their capacity to heal nor underestimate their capacity to cause harm. You could take this statement, you could X out doctors, you could insert pastors, you could insert priests, you could insert spiritual or church leaders, you could just insert Christians should neither overestimate their capacity to heal nor underestimate their capacity to cause harm. Friends, we have the potential to do so much good, but whenever we aren't careful, we also have great potential to harm others. But I'm going to give us the benefit of the doubt for a moment, because I believe that a lot of us aren't seeking to do harm. Sometimes we don't find out until long after the fact the harm that we've done. Sometimes we never find out the harm that we've caused others. It takes real self-reflection to be aware of the harm that we are causing, and unless we are true psychopaths, we're not setting out seeking to harm other people. Most of that work is unintentional. It's as the psalmist wrote, but can anyone know what they've accidentally done wrong? Clear me of any unknown sin and save your servant from willful sins. Don't let them rule me, then I'll be completely blameless. I'll be innocent of great wrongdoing. The psalmist knows it. Sometimes we don't even know. We don't even know what the words were saying, their effect on other people. We don't know the harm that we're causing by the actions that we take. So sometimes we just need to go before God and say, God, help me to first do no harm before I do anything else. Help me to not harm others. All right, so Hippocrates came long before John Wesley, 2,200 years before John Wesley. But does that mean that he was the first to lay claim to this general rule of doing no harm? Maybe. But maybe the book of Proverbs would have something to say about it, because coming a few hundred years before Hippocrates, we read in Proverbs, don't plan to harm your neighbor who trusts and lives near you. Don't accuse anyone without reason when they haven't harmed you. Kind persons benefit themselves, but cruel people harm themselves. No harm happens to the righteous, but the wicked receive their fill of trouble. The fear of the Lord leads to life, then one rests content, untouched by harm. We can probably all think of some exceptions to those rules. Cruel people who seem to prosper, kind people who are harmed. But don't think of these as rules so much as aspirational. About this is how things should be. If we would only first begin by doing no harm, then blessing should follow from this. So who are we talking about, or what are we talking about here whenever we're talking about avoiding doing harm? Are we talking about ourselves? Are we talking about others? Are we talking about our relationship with God? To all of those, I give a resounding yes. Don't harm yourself, others, or your relationship with God. And I would add into the others really all of God's creation. As we move into Earth Day tomorrow, this really includes everything that God has created. Just be safe. Don't harm anyone. Don't harm anything. And by the way, speaking of tomorrow, tomorrow begins Passover, so be mindful of your Jewish friends and your Jewish family members as they are celebrating. All right. Don't harm anyone. Don't harm anything. And you might have noticed we were trying to kind of play on the fact that March Madness just ended by calling this series of talks the method to the madness. This is very similar to the March Madness logo in case you don't follow college basketball. But one thing is missing, a bracket. I thought about doing this as Methodism versus every other denomination. I thought about doing this as the theology of John Wesley versus the theology of any other theologian out there. But look, we don't need another fight. We don't need another battle. We don't need to do any more harm. I think once you hear the distinctive beliefs and practices, you already know that we're the best, so we don't have to put a bracket up there to show it. All right, so whenever we're thinking about the method to the madness, we sometimes need to realize that God takes this very seriously. We can make jokes all we want about a Methodist understanding of God being the best way to understand God, but Jesus actually said in relation to our desire to do no harm, as for whoever causes these little ones who believe in me to trip and fall into sin, it would be better for them to have a huge stone hung around their necks and be drowned in the bottom of the lake. So in essence, Jesus is saying that if you were thinking about harming others, if you were thinking about harming anyone, anything, it would be better if you took on that harm yourself rather than putting that harm onto anyone else or anything else. Look, I like to think of myself as a fairly disarming person. I smile a lot. I try not to raise my voice. I try to make space for others who have differing viewpoints. But there is an exception. If I perceive someone to be harming other people, If I perceive someone to be harming anything else, a switch will flip, and we'll do what we need to do in order to protect others. But we all need to ask the question of, how are we harming people? What are we doing unintentionally, sometimes intentionally, that are actually harming other people? I asked the internet this week. It's always fun to ask the internet questions. You never know what you'll hear, but sometimes you do. I asked the internet this week, how has the church harmed you? It wasn't completely along these lines, but it was mainly along the lines of women who had been harmed by men in church leadership, or sometimes simply women being harmed by patriarchy masquerading as Christianity. That was one clear theme that was popping up time and again. And there was another one that popped up as well in terms of how we, as in like the church, was harming people, and that was those in the LGBTQ community. There's a lot of hurt, a lot of pain out there caused by people who know a Bible verse and don't really know very much about grace. We need to be aware of the ways that we're harming people, even though it's very challenging to know sometimes the effects of our words, the effects of our actions. They are deep. They are there. And we need to do a better job of seeking out all of the ways that we are causing harm to other people. So there's a lot of commentary out there on how we can first do no harm, probably because of Hippocrates. Also, and from a particularly Methodist point of view, because it's the first general rule, there's also a lot of Methodist commentary out there on how we can first do no harm. I think it's interesting the way that Methodist theologian Kevin Watson puts it. He talks about it in terms of stop moving away from God. It's the idea that whenever we are harming others, we're actually putting distance between us and God. That whenever we take those harmful actions that hurt ourselves, that hurt others, that hurt the rest of God's creation, we're actually harming our relationship with God. And so, if you want to grow closer to God, start by first doing no harm. There's a lot of harm out there that we could talk about. I trust that you'll do the work of introspection and asking yourself how you might be harming others, how you might even be harming yourself, or how you might be putting that separation between you and God. However, we need to take a hard look at the faith and how seriously we are about continuing to pass it on. I know that this is something that we aspire to. If we're following Jesus, we want to pass it on. But the greatest threat to Christianity is not secularism or apathy or fundamentalism or science, as some might make it out to be. The greatest threat to Christianity is, Christians not acting like Christ. The greatest threat to Christianity is people who would claim to follow Jesus, who would do harm in spite of their faith, or maybe even because of our faith. Whenever we use our faith and we weaponize it in order to harm other people, we're doing untold amounts of damage. Look, Jesus is going to be fine in all of this, but sometimes I worry about his church whenever we don't lift it up, whenever we don't seek to follow him in everything that we do, whenever we don't put this Methodist first general rule into practice of first do no harm. And so, being right has its place. But whenever we're so focused on being right that we're harming other people, they often don't hear our rightness. We can speak the truth, but whenever we don't speak the truth in love, then no one wants to hear us, let alone if they're even able to hear us. So what if we were more concerned with not harming others than with being right? Could you imagine how how our families would change, how our workplaces would be transformed, how our communities would look completely different if only we sought to avoid doing harm. And we wanted that even more than we want to be right. Again, there's a lot of commentary out there on this. Hippocrates, Wesley, Methodism's general rule, the effects on medicine, probably many other contexts who have claimed this first general rule. But I was particularly struck by one list from a Methodist author. They wrote the list nearly 20 years ago in 2006, but it still feels like it rings true today. They wrote, refuse to gossip. This is how we can first do no harm. Avoid unfair criticism. Rely on fact rather than rumor. Be respectful and deal with disagreement openly and honestly. Could you imagine how differently things would be if only we sought to first do no harm by even just putting these 5 practices in place? How everything would change, how everything would be transformed, about how we would be able to put down our weapons, about how we would be able to see others as friends rather than enemies, or just others in general. Life would be different if we, before we did anything else, sought to do no harm to ourselves, to others, to the rest of God's creation, and to our relationship with God. I dabbled a bit at the beginning of the message with how I've had a unique journey with United Methodism. I've been a United Methodist for over 36 years. As I came to learn more and more about it, I saw it as a better and better fit for me personally. And after I really found out what Methodist theology was, I was set. I was all in. In fact, I was so all in that I became a United Methodist pastor. Now, over my time as a United Methodist pastor, have I experienced harm? Sure, from time to time. But guess what? I never, ever considered leaving the church over any of that harm. My own sense of calling was simply too strong for that to happen. However, there are a couple times whenever I've considered leaving this particular denomination, but it wasn't over those times of personal harm. It was whenever I saw the church harming others. Those are the times that I gave serious thought to whether or not this could be a home for me. Look, we all need to do our own research. We all need to do our own homework. We all need to come to our own conclusions. But ultimately, I decided that it was better to fight that others wouldn't be harmed rather than abandoning them, rather than leaving them. And I still believe that this is the very best way that we can relate to God. So, seek to do no harm. Before you do anything else, avoid doing harm in all that you do, in your action, in your speech. Before you pick up anything else, before you try to do anything else, first begin by doing no harm.